I want to play for you one of the most chilling clips I've ever heard. And just hold on and trust me, because it's not that chilling until you realize what it means.
The basic idea was that we could never win an election on getting certain things because we were in such a small minority. But maybe you could actually unilaterally change the world without having to constantly convince people and beg people and plead with people who are never going to agree with you through a technological means. And this is where I think technology is this incredible alternative to politics.
That's tech billionaire and Republican megadonor Peter Thiel speaking at a Libertopia, a libertarian conference in 2010. He's basically saying that his political ideology is so unappealing that it'll never win elections. And that's one thing he's right about, because he's railed against women having the right to vote, complained so much about diversity, and written some really disgusting stuff about sexual assault and consent. But he knows that he can use technology as a unilateral alternative to politics, and that should really freak you out. Thiel is one of the co-founders and biggest investors in Palantir, a CIA-funded technology company that has contracts across the government for their data software. Here's their CFO speaking a few years ago.
We continue to advance our mission of becoming the U.S. government's central operating system as we extend our footprint across defense, healthcare, and civilian agencies.
And while both President Obama and Biden did sign Palantir contracts, President Trump is taking it way further. There are new contracts with ICE, something literally called Immigration OS, and the IRS. So 15 years ago, Peter Thiel, like the supervillain in a movie explaining his plan to the hero, admitted that he can use technology to get his ideas across when they're unpopular, completely subverting democracy. And today, one of his technology companies is gaining more and more power within the government, building the very systems our government relies on. And oh yeah, this is the CEO.
The central risk to Palantir and America and the world is a regressive way of thinking that is corrupting and corroding our institutions, that calls itself progressive, but actually, and is called woke, but is actually a form of a thin pagan religion.
If you're a progressive, if you have progressive values, meaning you just, care about other people, the CEO of the company building America's technological back end thinks of you as the central risk. He thinks of you as the enemy. Are these the people you want running the systems you rely on, or worse, the systems that surveil you?
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be talking about Silicon Valley and the one thing the tech industry cannot manufacture, no matter how much money it has, and that thing is called trust. What shocked me the most when I was going through this file and looking into Silicon Valley a little bit closer is the eugenics. Yeah, I knew that the founders of Stanford were into eugenics, but the depth of it is actually, quite surprising. And the man they call the godfather of Silicon Valley, a man named William Shockley, he was a co-inventor of the transistor. And I don't want to bury the lead because this is the part that gets kind of crazy. People close to Shockley, like Andy Grove and Robert Noyce, they never mentioned the eugenics part. As a matter of fact, I look back and there was two founders of Intel, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce. And then Andy Grove came along to be the organizing, to run the place. And I look back about the things they've written. As a matter of fact, Gordon Moore wrote a big piece about Shockley for the Time magazine. And it was a big, big piece because what he did was extraordinary, what he invented, right? In terms of the computer industry. Well, Gordon Moore in that big article never mentioned the eugenics part of the whole deal. Just kind of avoided it. And the editors of Time went in and they actually added the eugenics part, but Gordon Moore himself did not mention the eugenics part. So there's been a pretty big wall of silence around Shockley. So who was Shockley? Well, William Bradford Shockley was an American physicist, inventor, and the co-inventor of the transistor. He shared the 1956 Nobel Peace Prize in Physics with John Bardeen and William Brayton for their work at Bell Labs. He later founded Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory, and that was pivotal in the birth of Silicon Valley. Though his autocratic management led to what they call the traitorous eight, meaning a group got together and left because they found him just a little bit too difficult to deal with. So the traitorous eight left the Shockley Laboratory, and they formed Fairchild Semiconductor. And at that time, Shockley had authored a book called Electrons and Holes in Semiconductors and held over 90 patents in the field. But here's the interesting part. So that was 1956 when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. We'll roll forward, not that far forward. In 1965, Shockley's career took an abrupt turn from internationally famous physicist to what they called a racist crank when he gave an address at the Nobel Conference on, the title was Genetics and the Future of Man. Excuse me. In his lecture, Shockley warned of the threat of genetic deterioration and evolution in reverse, problems exasperated, he claimed, by the great society welfare programs that allowed the less genetically fit to reproduce at will, free from the constraints of natural selection. Shockley also promoted a voluntary sterilization bonus plan under which people with lower IQ scores would be financially encouraged to undergo sterilization. He was also involved in a thing called the Pioneer Fund, and that financed Shockley's activities. And some of that fund went straight through Stanford University. An engineering history source puts the Pioneering Fund grants through the Stanford at nearly $1.5 million in inflation. So this fund that he was working on direct ties to Stanford University, and this is really critical. As a matter of fact, right there at Stanford, they have archival holdings for Shockley, and it contains materials regarding eugenics and heredity, including his 1965 population control and eugenics material and correspondence responding to criticism from Stanford's genetics department. Shockley wasn't some peripheral Stanford professor who happened to believe in eugenics. He was one of the central figures in the creation of Silicon Valley itself. He brought semiconductor development to Mountain View, recruited the people who founded Fairchild Semiconductor, and from the Fairchild lineage came Intel and much of the semiconductor industry that gave Silicon Valley its name. The silicon in Silicon Valley means the chemical element silicon, the semiconductor material used to make integrated circuits or computer chips. The term Silicon Valley was popularized in 1971 by journalist Don Hoffler because so many companies in the Santa Clara Valley were manufacturing silicon-based semiconductor devices. But here's where he took a turn, beginning publicly in 1965 and continuing through the 1970s and into the 1980s. William Shockley actively campaigned for eugenics ideas. The campaign was especially intense from about 1969 to 1974, when he was, in fact, a Stanford professor and already one of the most famous figures associated with the creation of Silicon Valley. So then the company Fairchild was born in 1957. Silicon Valley's semiconductor industry explodes. Shockley arrives formally at Stanford in 1963, right around the time he made his first eugenics campaign. And this is an interesting juncture, and this is why I love timelines, because when Shockley is getting started with his eugenics business, what happens? Well, he gets a job at Stanford as a professor. So, and he actually stayed a professor through all of this stuff. So, and that's really the remarkable part, because Shockley had already helped create the semiconductor industry that became Silicon Valley. And then he spent years very publicly campaigning the eugenics while at Stanford. People could disagree with him, protest him, or refuse him a particular platform, but they could hardly claim they didn't know what William Shockley was saying. So yes, he was a very visible person right there on Stanford campus. So besides his work in physics, Shockley became increasingly focused on intelligence and heredity. He argued that IQ data demonstrated heredity differences in intelligence between racial groups and advocated eugenics policies based on those beliefs. Shockley cited David Starr Jordan, and we'll be getting back to him in a bit. David Starr Jordan was the first president of Stanford University and also big into eugenics. So Shockley in his work cited David Starr Jordan. So just tuck that name away in your hat there, as an inspiration for his beliefs, sharing many of the same worries about the decline of American racial health. In Shockley's August 1980 Playboy interview, he defended his views by pointing directly to David Starr Jordan. Shockley said that earlier prominent scholars had expressed the same ideas for which he was being attacked, then specifically stated this. He said, Stanford's revered president, David Starr Jordan, stressed the same theme in a book, The Blood of a Nation. The Blood of the Nation. And Jordan's book isn't ambiguous either. Its full title was this, The Blood of the Nation, a study of the decay of races through the survival of the unfit. And that was from David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford University. So I'll keep reading. William Bradford Shockley was, at the time of his death in 1989, perhaps the most reviled man in America. His public image, created by a relentless, hostile press, was that of a mad scientist, firmly in the service of evil. His crime was not merely to have a publicized, unacceptable views on race, intelligence, and genetics, but to have lent him the prestige of a Nobel laureate in physics. Shockley on Eugenics and Race was edited by a Dr. Roger Pearson, and it is a collection of Dr. Shockley's papers written from 1965 to 1975. This was the very decade during which leftist, egalitarian thinking was tightening its grip on the country. It is hazardous enough today to preach heresy on the subject of race and intelligence, but to have done so when Dr. Shockley was the most active was to court assassination. It was only due to Dr. Shockley's prominence as a scientist that he was able to get a hearing at all. When in 1965 he began to preach eugenic heresies, his views hit the country like a bomb. So, Shockley has quite a history. I'll be getting more back into that. So, I want to disclose a little bit about my relationship with Silicon Valley because I have some pretty distinct views about things, and I want to disclose those. By the time I left Silicon Valley in 1999, I was 48 years old. I was convinced that Silicon Valley was run by psychopaths, and I set out to learn more about who are these people hiding behind those masks, yet can appear so normal, really. Who were they? It was not a popular decision. The world was viewing them as heroes. Intel had relocated me to Silicon Valley around 1978, and I became Intel's first corporate trade show and events person, and I worked in the corporate marketing building. This was long before Intel became the household name it eventually became. The company was very different then. I worked in the main offices in Santa Clara, California. The top people in the company were right there in this relatively simple two-story building. A lone security guard at the front door. We collected competitors' brochures and information and actually put them into file cabinets. Silicon Valley itself was very different then. It wasn't yet this enormous cultural and political power that it became. It wasn't loaded with billionaire celebrities. We didn't even have computers on our desks. That should give you some idea of where technology was at the time. There's a very famous story from that era about Gordon Moore. Even Gordon Moore was reportedly perplexed by the idea of a personal computer and wondered what ordinary people would actually do with one. Perhaps he thought a housewife could use it to store recipes. And at Intel during that time, the accounting department was still run using microfiche. That's how different the world was. We were sitting inside one of the companies that would help create the modern computer age, and even there, the world we take for granted today hadn't even arrived. I eventually left Intel and started my own consulting firm. That wasn't particularly unusual in Silicon Valley at that time. People moved around. We worked for different companies, became consultants, started businesses, and most of us knew each other. Years later, I was designing promotional consumer products using Intel chips. I worked on that project for close to 5 years. The timing is important. Intel had achieved enormous success with its Intel Inside campaign. Instead of remaining an invisible component buried inside somebody else's computer, Intel had figured out how to make ordinary consumers recognize the name of the company that made the processor. My project was intended to extend that recognition into the retail marketplace in a new way. After nearly 5 years of work, the project was finally approaching the point where it would go before Intel's executive staff for approval. And then the Pentium computer chip crisis happened. My project had just started. We were making great sales, but it got yanked. Then a miracle of sorts happened, and it got started all over again. I'd sold a big order to Harvard Bookstore, and when they called me to cancel the second time, I told them we couldn't because of the Harvard order. That was the only reason the project continued. We got to ship to Harvard, but the project was on hold again. Then a miracle happened. A journalist who'd gone to Harvard saw my design in the Harvard newsletter. And bingo, I was back in business. Well, only for a while. They decided to copy my designs. I ended up having to sue them and blah, 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 blah. And it was during those years that I figured out a lot. I started looking at the psychopaths because of how the people turned and acted. I started becoming suspicious of the researchers, Robert Hare and Shockley. So I want to start this story in 1994 when the Pentium issue got going. I was working at Intel as a consultant when the company learned a very expensive lesson about what happens when people stop trusting the people behind technology. For anyone who doesn't remember the Pentium controversy, the Pentium chip was Intel's new generation of microprocessors, the chip at the heart of a personal computer. Intel had spent years turning itself from a company most consumers had never heard of into a household name through its enormously successful Intel Inside campaign. By the early 1990s, people who knew virtually nothing about semiconductors knew that little Intel Inside logo. Intel wasn't simply selling computer chips anymore. Intel was selling its name. And that meant it was selling trust, Trust. Then a mathematics professor named Thomas Nicely started getting strange results while doing calculations involving prime numbers with a new Pentium chip. He eventually traced the problem to the Pentium processor's floating point division operation. There was a flaw in the chip. The existence of a flaw by itself shouldn't have become the catastrophe that followed. Technology is complicated. Products have defects. Engineers find problems and companies fix them. The problem was how Intel handled it. Intel had already discovered the defect internally before Nicely brought it to public attention. The company had decided that the error would occur so rarely in ordinary computing that most users were extremely unlikely ever to encounter it. Technically, Intel had an argument, but from the customer's perspective, something very different had just happened. You sold me a processor. You discovered that the processor could produce an incorrect answer. You didn't tell me. Someone outside the company discovered it independently, and now you're telling me that I shouldn't worry about it because you've calculated that it probably won't affect me. That is how a technical problem becomes a trust problem. And Nicely was almost the worst possible person for Intel to have on the other side of this. He wasn't some giant competitor trying to destroy Intel. He wasn't IBM. He wasn't AMD. He wasn't a politician or an activist. He was a mathematician professor doing mathematics, and other people could reproduce what he found. But that controversy exploded. IBM eventually stopped shipping Pentium-based computers. Intel changed course in December of 1994 and agreed to replace affected Pentium processors for customers who requested it. Contemporary industry analysts put the resulting charge at roughly $475 million. I remember this period particularly well because I was there. I was working at Intel when this was happening. And what stayed with me wasn't simply that Intel had made a defective chip. It was watching what happened when this enormously successful technology company found itself confronting something it couldn't engineer its way around. People had to believe you. Intel survived it, and Intel remained an enormously important company. And the Pentium itself became successful. But the episode became a classic lesson in corporate crisis management because Intel helped turn a small, obscure mathematical defect into a much larger question. Can I trust this company to tell me the truth when something goes wrong? And I've never forgotten that. And now, more than 30 years later, I think we're watching the technology industry confront the same question again. But this time, the stakes are enormously larger. We're no longer talking about whether one processor occasionally produces the wrong answer. We're talking about artificial intelligence, personal information, employment, algorithm, surveillance, data centers, electricity, water, enormous concentrations of wealth, and a small group of extraordinarily powerful technology executives telling us what the future is going to look like. And something very interesting happened along the way. The public's trust in the people building that future hasn't gone up. It has gone down. And I want to show you how it got here. The weakest point in a trust-based system isn't necessarily where the most money resides. It can be wherever an outsider can independently test the system claims. And I put this into groups so we can look at it in simpler terms. The 1980s to the 1990s were considered by most to be the golden years. Technology is exciting. Personal computers are empowering ordinary people. Silicon Valley represents invention, opportunity, and the future. 2000 to 2002, the dot-com crash, the first enormous tarnish. Companies collapse and investors lose fortunes, but ordinary people aren't necessarily rejecting technology. The technology itself continues becoming useful. 2003 to 2010, technology comes roaring back. Google, Amazon, broadband, YouTube, Facebook, the iPhone. The bargain still appears overwhelmingly favorable to consumers. Remarkable new capabilities, often seemingly free. 2010 to 2018, the bargain changes. Tracking, personal data, algorithm, and monopoly power become increasingly visible. Technology isn't merely something people use anymore. A few companies increasingly mediate people's lives. 2018 to 2020, trust takes a hit. In 2018, the Cambridge Analytica scandal exposed how personal information from tens of millions of Facebook users have been collected without their proper consent and used to build profiles for political targeting. Suddenly, the issue wasn't just what people voluntarily posted online. It was this: how much information are these companies collecting about us? Who are they giving it to? And what are they doing with it? 2020 to 2023, big tech becomes personal. Platforms become deeply entangled with work, politics, speech, and everyday life. The CEOs themselves become recognizable political and cultural figures. 2023 to 2026, AI changes the equation. Now the concerns include jobs, personal data, creative work, deep fakes, electricity, water, education, and enormous data centers. Technology isn't merely offering people something new. People increasingly perceive themselves as bearing some or most of the costs. There was a CNBC Generation Lab poll, and it's real and it's recent. It surveyed 1,088 Americans aged 18 to 34. Every major AI figure they asked about failed to win majority trust. Alan Karp, the guy from Palantir, was distrusted by 81%. Peter Thiel by 79%. Dario Amodi by 76%. Sundar Pichai by 74%. And roughly 7 in 10 distrusted Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Sam Altman. Even the best performer, Satya Nadella, was distrusted by 65%. But I think the more consequential number is this: 60% want AI data center construction slowed down. Only 15% want it accelerated. That is significant because the argument is moving from this, I don't like Zuckerberg, to I don't want the physical infrastructure supporting this expansion built at this place. That's a completely different political problem. And another recent poll reinforces that this isn't confined to one survey. Gallup reported this month that only 27% of Americans trust businesses a lot or some to use AI responsibly. Among people 18 to 29, trust dropped from 30% in 2025 to just 20% in 2026, while 41% now say they have no trust at all. And there's another interesting development. Much of this criticism is now coming from inside the AI industry itself. More than 1,000 workers at major AI companies recently signed a letter calling for mechanisms to slow developments when necessary. Signatories reportedly include people from OpenAI, Anthropic, and Meta. And even Alex Karp, the guy who gets the spectacular 81% distrust number, has been publicly attacking the AI industry sales pitch. He said last month that AI models have been irresponsibly oversold and that corporate customers are complaining about paying for AI that isn't producing sufficient value. So there are really three pressures converging at once. Personal distrust. People don't trust the men running the companies. Economic distrust. People are questioning whether AI will actually improve their lives and careers. In that CNBC poll, 45% expected AI to hurt their careers. Only 10% expected it to help. Infrastructure resistance, electricity, water, data centers, land use, and local effects are turning an abstract technology debate into something people can encounter in their own communities. That third one may ultimately matter the most. And I'd like to point to something very interesting about this Silicon Valley in general. And I'll be getting much more into the eugenics stuff in a bit here. There was an event that happened recently, and Silicon Valley investors, including Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, helped accelerate the run on Silicon Valley Bank. Founders Fund was among the venture capital firms that reportedly advised its portfolio companies to withdraw their money from Silicon Valley Bank as concerns about the bank spread. Basically, what happened was there was a bank in Silicon Valley called Silicon Valley Bank. And all of these people, it's called the Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, and the big venture capitalist people, they all have their money here at Silicon Valley Bank, okay? So basically what happened was that Peter Thiel himself caused what would be considered a run on the bank, right? Well, the bank then got bailed out. So you're saying, well, yeah, they should bail them out because they're approved by the FDIC. Well, actually, these people, these financial wizards running Silicon Valley, had much more than is allowed by the FDIC ruling. So basically, instead of $250,000 in their account, which would normally be covered by that insurance, these people had millions of dollars in their account. Was that ignorance or arrogance? I don't know. You'll have to decide. So anyway, so basically what happened was Peter Thiel's fund, called the Founders Fund, accelerated this run on the bank, okay? The withdrawals quickly became a stampede. Customers attempted to pull about $42 billion in a single day, and regulators closed Silicon Valley Bank on March the 10th, 2023. And then came the extraordinary part. There's rules for thee, but not for me, right? Ordinary FDIC insurance protected deposits only up to $250,000 per depositor, per insured bank, and per ownership category. Many Silicon Valley Bank customers were companies and investors holding millions of dollars, sometimes vastly more above the insured limit. After the bank collapsed, thanks to Peter Thiel, right, the federal government invoked a systematic risk exception. That's a nice way of saying bailing out the rich, right? So after the bank collapsed, the federal government invoked a systematic risk exception and guaranteed all of the Silicon Valley Bank deposits, including the uninsured deposits above the normal FDIC limit. So Silicon Valley investors helped accelerate the run on Silicon Valley Bank. The bank collapsed. Then the government stepped in and protected the remaining Silicon Valley depositors from losses on money that ordinary FDIC insurance had never guaranteed. The FDIC later disclosed that Silicon Valley Bank, their 10 largest deposit accounts collectively held, get this, $13.3 billion. And that was held just in 10 accounts, $13.3 billion. And that worked out to roughly $1.3 billion per account. I think they're a little bit over that limit. These were sophisticated investors and companies that knowingly kept billions of dollars in deposits above the FDIC insurance limit. When their bank collapsed, the federal government didn't make them live with the risk they had accepted. It changed the normal outcome and guaranteed the uninsured deposits too. Silicon Valley customers knowingly kept enormous sums, sometimes hundreds of millions more, in accounts far beyond the $250,000 federal insurance limit. Silicon Valley Bank had effectively become a financial hub for the venture capital startup world, with enormous concentrations of money sitting above the normal FDIC limit. And I have all of the stuff posted down below and over on my website. I mean, it is really staggering. One company, and these mainly were about 25% of these people were venture capitalists, and the other percentage were just regular high-tech companies. But like this company, I think they're venture capital called Circle Internet Financial, and they had about $3.3 billion sitting there. Sequoia Capital, their venture capital, they had about $1 billion, and the list goes on. So yeah, all the way down to, let me see, somebody down here at the bottom only had Eiger Biopharmaceuticals. They only had 8.3 million. So roughly it went from 3.3 billion with a B. So the amounts come from a combination of company disclosures and subsequently reported FDIC deposit records. So the names at the top make the scale especially striking because that company Circle had roughly $3.3 billion. It's just unbelievable, right? And Sequoia Capital had about $1 billion, despite the ordinary limit of $250,000. Silicon Valley's venture capital establishment built its reputation on being exceptionally sophisticated about money and risk, yet billions of dollars were sitting uninsured at Silicon Valley Bank, and when the bank failed, the federal government ultimately protected those uninsured deposits anyways. Just so you understand the area, the venture capital people, or we call them VCs, they're kind of like, well, they're treated very godlike, right? Like if there's a VC in the room and you're giving a presentation, all eyes are on that VC, right? Because they're the ones that hold the big purses, right? The big money bag, they call it, right? But yeah, so these big VCs, they even live in their own area, because you'll hear them talk about a place called Sand Hill in Menlo Park. Yeah, that's where they all work out of the same area. So you hear talk about the Sand Hill people. So all the rest of Silicon Valley really started around Santa Clara. That's where I started with Intel, was in Santa Clara. But the whole hub was really San Jose, Santa Clara, that whole hub area there. So they kind of always sat up over on this hill, and Menlo Park is actually, it is a hill. So, so, so Silicon Valley's venture capital establishment built its reputation on being exceptionally sophisticated about money and risk. Yet billions of dollars were sitting there in that bank. And Sand Hill Road adds something numbers alone don't convey. They were among the people Silicon Valley itself regarded as the experts at deciding who deserved capital and which risks were worth taking. So the people in charge of what risks were worth taking were taking a pretty big risk themselves, right? Because for years, big tech was mostly invisible infrastructure. Somebody could despise Facebook and still use Facebook. Google could operate enormous server farms somewhere the user never saw. But the AI build-out changes that equation because the physical requirements are enormous. And once the argument becomes, why is this data center being built here? What is it doing to our electricity system? And why should we bear the cost? The political coalition opposed unchecked expansion can become much broader than people who simply dislike AI. Yes, it's always a struggle when you're a psychopath, right? Because you want to roll into town, run over all these people, and just assume that they're going to pay for everything and you'll be just fine. Well, people woke up and decided, why are we bowing to these people that are worth billions of dollars in our dinky little town when we can barely afford our own fees? Why are we picking up the extra for the tech world? Yeah, that remains a big, big question of all times, right? If you figure out that question, see now, if they weren't complete psychos about this whole deal, what you would do is you would roll into town, you'd make sure everybody in town was compensated fairly, and then everything would probably go quite smoothly, right? But when you take this blinded, aggressive approach, just like they're doing with those flock cameras, well, people are going to have their own views, right? But that speaks to the trust, right? And people are no longer trusting Silicon Valley. Because now, increasingly, the tech billionaires equal entrenched corporations with enormous influence over government, information, infrastructure, and employment. Once that mental picture flips, disruption stops sounding rebellious. The tech companies became the establishment long time ago. And these numbers suggest that among younger Americans, that transition is already quite far along. When 60% of young adults say slow down data center construction, and an overwhelming majority say they don't trust the people directing AI, we're considerably beyond, well, people are getting rich and tired of the tech bros. The old social bargain itself is being questioned. The industry's original promise was essentially, we're going to use technology to give you more power. The emerging public suspicion is almost its mirror image. You're using technology to acquire more power over us. That is a tarnish that the dot-com crash never produced, is more consequential. The tech leaders are increasingly fighting with another in public. And this also goes to the trust issue. When you have so-called leaders of these industries all arguing in public, the public is going to lose more trust, right? Right now we have Elon Musk attacks Altman. Altman and Musk have fought over AI. Karp attacks part of the AI industry. AI companies criticize competitors' safety models, business practices, politics, or motives. Zuckerberg and Musk have publicly feuded. Thiel, Musk, Karp, Altman, and others are increasingly discuss not simply as executives, but as members of competing technological and political power centers. That can destroy one of the things Silicon Valley benefited from for decades, the appearance of competition. Excuse me. Let me start over. That can destroy one of the things Silicon Valley benefited from for decades, the appearance of competence and common purpose. In the old mythology, these were the brilliant people quietly building tomorrow. Now the public can see extremely wealthy men essentially saying, don't trust that guy. His company is dangerous. He's lying. His AI isn't what he says it is. My technology is better. Eventually, an ordinary person doesn't have to decide which billionaire is correct. A perfectly understandable reaction is this: fine, I don't trust any of you. If distrust were concentrated on one figure, say Zuckerberg, that could be explained as a Zuckerberg problem. If it were Musk alone, it could be a Musk problem. If it were Altman alone, OpenAI would have an Altman problem. But when every name is underwater, it begins looking like a class or industry credibility problem. There is another reversal from the dot-com era. Back then, the spectacular failures helped clean out the industry. The public watched ridiculous companies collapse while genuinely useful technologies survived. Today, the people at the center aren't failed entrepreneurs asking investors for another 20 million. They themselves are extraordinarily wealthy individuals controlling enormous companies, infrastructure, and pools of capital, while publicly clawing at one another over who should control the next technological era. That doesn't necessarily make the public interested in determining which tech bro has the superior argument. It could make the public say, who asked any of you to decide this for everybody else? That question becomes even harder to ignore because the people running these companies are far more visible than the technology executives of an earlier era. The visibility of the technology executives has changed dramatically. During the 1978 to 1999 period, there were enormously powerful executives. Intel's Gordon Moore, Andy Grove, and Robert Noyce. HP had executives, National Semiconductor, Fairchild, AMD, and the rest. But the average American generally wasn't following their personalities, their private lives, their philosophies, their diets, their drug habits, their relationships, their religious beliefs, or predictions about humanity. Even within Silicon Valley, much of that information circulated inside the industry rather than through mass popular culture. The corporation and its products were generally much more famous than the people running it. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were arguably the two technology figures the general public knew best before the current generation of Musk, Zuckerberg, etc. They weren't merely CEOs. They became media personalities and symbols of the computer revolution. Steve Jobs was repeatedly photographed for major magazines and became inseparable from the Apple brand. His black turtleneck, product launches, and rebel visionary image eventually became part of popular culture. Even people who knew very little about technology knew Steve Jobs. Bill Gates had an interesting, different trajectory. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the press frequently presented him as a young computer genius or whiz kid billionaire. But Microsoft's dominance eventually changed that image. The U.S. government's landmark antitrust case against Microsoft began in 1998, and Bill Gates' videotape deposition became notorious because prosecutors portrayed him as evasive and combative. A federal court ultimately found Microsoft had maintained its operating system monopoly through anti-competitive means. So by the late 1990s, Bill Gates wasn't simply the lovable computer whiz anymore. Microsoft had become the giant that people worried was becoming too powerful. Then comes the fascinating image transition. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was established in its current form in 2000, and Gates increasingly moved his public identity away from Microsoft and toward global health, vaccines, education, poverty, and philanthropy. He stepped away from Microsoft's day-to-day leadership and eventually became known to a younger generation at least as much for philanthropy as for Microsoft. And sometimes it doesn't fall too far from the tree. Bill Gates' daughter, Phoebe Gates, is interestingly enough involved in a scandal of her own. His daughter, Phoebe Gates, has a company called PHIA, P-H-I-A. It is a shopping startup founded by Bill Gates' daughter, Phoebe Gates, and her former Stanford roommate, Sophia Kiani. The company has reportedly raised about $43 million and was valued at roughly $185 million in early 2026. But in 2026, PHIA was accused of doing what's called cookie stuffing. Put simply, when someone buys something online, a tracking code can determine who gets the commission for sending that customer to the store. PHIA was accused of inserting its own code and potentially taking credit for sales it didn't actually generate. Imagine this. I'm saying that Bill Gates' daughter, he's raised a little crook of his own. Huh. Affiliate platform Impact.com suspended PHIA. PHIA says it fixed the problem and is correcting improperly attributed transactions. This sounds familiar because an app called Honey, it was a coupon shopping extension that PayPal bought for about $4 billion, and it faced a similar controversy. Imagine that. They even steal their crimes from each other, right? Honey was accused of replacing other people's affiliate codes with its own and potentially collecting commissions that otherwise would have gone to the person who actually referred the customer. Both PHIA and Honey were accused of using browser technology to take credit for online sales generated by somebody else and the money attached to those sales. PHIA is a digital assistant co-founded by Gates and fellow Stanford alumni. They reacted with shock. They were shocked. They said, "We're so shocked," in July, following reports that it was dropping more web cookies than it should, effectively taking online undue credit for driving sales at retail partners. But according to a new Bloomberg report, the young entrepreneurs, the shocked ones, we're so shocked, how did this happen? They had known for at least 7 months that this startup was overcounting its sales commissions. And now we have the next generation accused of figuring out how to take a cut from transactions they didn't generate. I would say she is a chip off the old block. And when I return, I need to take a break now for a while. And when I return, I'm going to be getting into this eugenics. And I'm telling you, the eugenics thread running through Stanford and also Bill Gates' own father is very, very intense. I'm not even I would have no reason to make things sound worse than they are because, frankly, this whole eugenics thing is actually pretty off the charts horrific as it stands on its own. No reason to speculate or get wound up about things because this stuff is wound up, and they seem to be all focused on black people. So when I come back, we will get into the eugenics and how this all tied into Stanford University and Bill Gates' father and all that stuff. Be back on the other. Okay. And to understand eugenics, we need to understand Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, the leading organization advocating abortion in the United States today. Darwinism had a profound influence on her thinking, including her conversion to and active support of eugenics. She was specifically concerned with reducing the population of the less fit, including inferior races such as Negroes. One major result of her lifelong work was to support the sexual revolution that has radically changed our society. Early in her career, Sanger became a follower of Thomas Malthus, Mathus, the same man that inspired Darwin. Malthus' disciples, then called Malthusians and Neo-Malthusians, taught that if Western civilization were to survive, the physically unfit, the materially poor, the spiritually diseased, the radically inferior, and the mentally incompetent had to somehow be suppressed and isolated or perhaps even eliminated. The early American birth control movement that developed into Planned Parenthood was deeply intertwined with the eugenics movement. Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. It later merged with her clinical organization to become the Birth Control Federation of America in 1939 and was renamed Planned Parenthood Federation of America in 1942. And the eugenics connection isn't something that has to be inferred. Planned Parenthood itself now acknowledges it. Its own history says this. Sanger believed in eugenics and says she repeatedly expressed her belief in and alignment with the eugenics movement in her writings. Even an older Planned Parenthood historical document says that Sanger used Birth Control Review to forge an alliance with the eugenics movement. There is an especially useful piece of primary history evidence that I came up with, and it's this. 1925 to 26, the 6th International Neo-Malthusian and Birth Control Conference. It was associated with the American Birth Control League, and it produced 4 volumes. And listen to this. Volume 3 was literally titled Medical and Eugenics Aspects of Birth Control. And here in this country, we have this crazy thing about everybody's fighting to keep abortions going, right? Well, I was one of those people years ago, and I even said it with a microphone in my hand. So, yeah, I mean, we're all practicing, not we all, but a lot of people are now practicing offering up infants to Satan, right? That is what birth control is really all about. So how on earth are you thinking, how does this relate to Silicon Valley? Well, I got the answer for you. Bill Gates Sr., named William H. Gates II, was significantly involved with Planned Parenthood, not merely a casual donor. The University of Washington's biography of Gates Sr. says his volunteer leadership included serving as president of Planned Parenthood. So we got a pretty direct connection here, right? William Gates Sr. would continue his eugenics efforts by becoming instrumental in the foundation of a new philanthropic brainchild called the William H. Gates Foundation in 1994. The group, like Planned Parenthood, would first focus on improving reproductive and child health in the developing world. After pioneering philanthropic activities, the company merged with the new Gates Learning Foundation to create the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2000. So, looks like a pretty direct connection to eugenics, if you ask me. And what's the daughter doing? That gypsy princess of theirs, Phoebe Gates. Well, she's also on the team, right? The most I could find out about Phoebe Gates was this. She is an abortion reproductive rights activist and major donor, honored by the organization formerly known as NARAL, NARAL, and she has committed millions to abortion access organizations. There was a $750,000 donation that I found to an abortion rights campaign, also heavily funded by Planned Parenthood, and publicly signed the I'm for Planned Parenthood campaign. So yes, the daughter is definitely into the deal, right? So here's how it worked out. 1925 to 1926, there was that 6th International Neo-Malthusian and Birth Control Conference, and that associated with the American Birth Control League, and that was what produced those volumes, Eugenics and the Aspects of Birth Control. So, I did a little tracing of the people involved in the eugenics, and yeah, they all connect. I've got all the timelines you're going to look at down below, but basically, Bill Gates' father, or Bill Gates Sr., by 1972, he is documented on Planned Parenthood's national board. So yeah, he was on the national board, and Gates Sr. told Salon magazine in 1998 that population was an interest for Bill Jr. and had been since he was a kid. He explicitly connected his son's interest with his own, calling it a fit between Bill's proclivities and his. So yeah, he actually bragged in 1998 that Bill Jr. has been into this stuff since he was a kid. So, and then I'll read you a short article, because for years and years and years, Planned Parenthood denied Margaret Sanger's role. So I'll read you this short clip here. It was with astonishment that I learned several days ago that Planned Parenthood of Manhattan had decided to remove the name Margaret Sanger from its headquarters and had encouraged other Planned Parenthood affiliates to do the same. The authorities cited Sanger's eugenicism and racism as the motives for this dethronement of the iconic founder of the Birth Control League and its successor, Planned Parenthood. Until recently, anyone who criticized Sanger in print would be swiftly rebutted by Planned Parenthood apologists who insisted that the charges of eugenicism and racism were false. But stubborn facts and our nation's new scrutiny of our racial history has eroded the mythology of Sanger and laid bare her eugenics projects in its racist, coercive details. So, yeah, we're really talking about also this generation of tech people being so out there, right? Because today we know a lot about them, which has essentially led to distrust, right? Because when you learn a lot of things about people, let's say that when you learn that Musk uses ketamine, that starts to chip away at your trust, right? Because then you start wondering, gee, he made kind of a crazy statement the other day. I wonder if it was a ketamine speaking, right? But here's what we have today. Today, we know that Musk uses ketamine. Peter Thiel talks about the Antichrist and radical life extension. Altman discusses psychedelic experiences and AGI transforming civilization. Huberman tells millions of people how to manipulate their dopamine and physiology. Zuckerberg does MMA and builds an enormous Hawaiian compound, and Karp gives philosophical interviews about war, Western civilization, and political ideology. And they aren't exactly being exposed by the tabloids. Much of it comes directly from them. The old executive back in my day could run an enormously consequential semiconductor company and remain virtually anonymous outside business and engineering cycles. The modern tech executive today often deliberately becomes a public intellectual, celebrity, political actor, podcast interview personality, and lifestyle figure or futurist. Social media obviously enabled this, but podcasts are probably just as important. A 3-hour interview gives Musk, Thiel, Karp, Andreessen, or Altman an opportunity that Gordon Moore simply didn't have in 1982. Millions of ordinary people can listen to the CEO explain how he thinks humanity should develop. It doesn't necessarily mean that earlier executives weren't eccentric. Some undoubtedly were. The critical difference is that we usually did not know. There was no X account, no YouTube archive, no Lex Friedman interviews, Joe Rogan appearances, viral conference clips, or podcast ecosystem continuously recording what these people think. I remember Silicon Valley when the powerful people were largely visible to one another, employees, trade press, and industry insiders. Now the people at the top are broadcasting themselves to everybody. Technology has removed the curtain that once separated corporate leadership from the public. So let's reel back to time here. 1883, the word eugenics. British scientist Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, coins the term eugenics in 1883. He derives it from Greek roots, meaning roughly good in birth or well-born. Stanford was founded at almost exactly the moment modern eugenics was emerging as a named scientific movement, and the man chosen to build the university was already absorbing and teaching those ideas. In 1884, Leland Stanford Jr. dies. Leland and Jane Stanford's only child, Leland Stanford Jr., dies of typhoid fever at age 15. His parents decide to establish a university in his memory. 1885, Stanford University is founded. Leland and Jane Stanford established Leland Stanford Jr. University using their fortune and their Palo Alto stock farm. The university is intended to combine liberal arts with science and engineering. 1891, Stanford opens. David Starr Jordan, the guy I mentioned earlier, becomes the first president. The university opens on October 1, 1891. Leland and Jane Stanford personally select David Starr Jordan as Stanford's first president. Jordan then begins recruiting the faculty and building the academic structure of the new university. So right here, exactly, that is the root when the guy, David Starr Jordan, a well-known eugenicist, is in charge of Stanford University, and Jordan begins recruiting the faculty and building the academic structure of the new So you really think he brought in people who loved people to live longer and all that? Or did he bring in people that shared his belief in eugenics? Yeah, I'd say probably shared, right? Because that was 1885. Yeah, excuse me, 1891 is when David Starr Jordan becomes the first president, okay? Then 1893, Leland Stanford dies. Leland Stanford dies only 2 years after the university opens. His death creates a serious financial crisis for the young university. Jane Stanford keeps it operating while Jordan continues running its academic affairs. I rented one of my first apartments. I got relocated to Silicon Valley. I didn't even know what back then, a friend said, "Hey, would you be interested in a job in Northern California?" And I said, "Sure, send me the link." Yeah, and that's how I ended up in Northern California. But yeah, the second apartment I rented was on Leland Avenue. It was right across from Stanford. So anyway, old Leland kicks the bucket in 1893. He dies only 2 years after the university opens. His death creates a serious financial crisis. Okay, so from the years of 1891 to 1913, quite a few years, David Starr Jordan presidency. Jordan remains Stanford's presidency for 22 years, giving him enormous influence over the university's formative period. Yeah, I'd say so. Eugenics becomes an important part of Jordan's activities. While being Stanford president, Jordan becomes the inaugural chairman. Okay, wait a second here. So, while Jordan was the Stanford president, he also becomes the inaugural chairman of the Eugenics Committee of the American Breeders Association, often identified as the first American eugenics organization. Stanford now says that Jordan used his position as president to advance eugenics through his teaching and advocacy. Well, Jordan later becomes a trustee of the Human Betterment Foundation, which promoted compulsory sterilization. So Stanford itself now describes its early sociology department as having eugenicist origins. Yeah, the next guy after Jordan was a guy named 1913 to 1915, John Casper Branner, Branner. Geologist John Casper Branner succeeds Jordan. He served only about 2 years. But Jordan doesn't disappear. After leaving the presidency, he remains at Stanford as chancellor. So when Jordan is done being president, the first president of Stanford, he remains at Stanford as a chancellor and later chancellor emeritus until his death in 1931. Pretty important position, if you ask me. Then next they had 1916 to 1943, Ray Lyndman Wilbur. Ray Lyndman Wilbur, a physician and former dean of Stanford Medical School, becomes Stanford's third president. During this period, eugenics remains part of Stanford's intellectual environment. One of the most important figures, and pay attention to this name because it'll keep reoccurring. So, during this period, eugenics remains part of Stanford's intellectual environment. One of the most important figures is psychologist Lewis Terman, who takes over Stanford's psychology department in 1922. Terman is famous for the Stanford Binet intelligence test and is also one of the major Stanford figures associated with American eugenics. And here we have another, like in the case of the Japanese people at ivermectin, we had a father-son team. We got another father-son team here. So let me keep all this straight here. So Lewis Terman's son is called Frederick Terman, who will become one of the central architects of Stanford's relationship with government-funded engineering in Silicon Valley. So 1943 to 48, this one guy is in charge. His presidency overlaps. And then that's when they do the big expansion of government-supported science and technology. Get those people, those white coats in charge, right? During this period, Frederick Terman becomes increasingly important. During World War II, Terman had headed Harvard's top secret radio research laboratory, which worked on electronic warfare and radar countermeasures. After returning to Stanford, Terman aggressively pursues government-sponsored research. By 1946, he was reporting Stanford projects supported by the Navy, Army, Air Forces, Signal Corps, and other agencies. But this guy dies unexpectedly in 1948, and the next guy that comes along, Wallace Stirling, becomes Stanford's fifth president. By the time Stirling takes over in 1949, classical American eugenics has been badly discredited, particularly following Nazi Germany in World War II. The world itself becomes so closely associated with Nazi racial policies that eugenics organizations begin changing their names and repositioning themselves. Stanford's emphasis is also shifting dramatically. Under Stirling, working closely with Frederick Terman, Stanford expands engineering and scientific research, aggressively recruits leading researchers, builds major research facilities, and capitalizes on the enormous post-war expansion of federal funding for university research. So that's when they figured out, well, gee, we could get all this money from the government to do all this work, right? Stanford's own historical account describes the post-war Stirling-Terman period as one in which they recognized the new opportunities for university research and helped push Stanford to a new level while contributing substantially to the growth of Silicon Valley. So the father, Lewis Terman, was a Stanford psychologist associated with intelligence testing and eugenics. The son, Frederick Terman, became Stanford's engineering dean and then provost and is frequently called one of the fathers of Silicon Valley. And let's talk about a few crimes that I would call them crimes that took place on campus. We have Elizabeth Holmes and the whole deal with Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes was a Stanford student when she began developing her idea for a new kind of blood testing technology. In 2003, at age 19, she dropped out of Stanford and founded Theranos. Stanford professor Channing Robertson became closely involved with the company. Another powerful supporter was George Shultz, the former U.S. Secretary of State and a prominent figure at Stanford's Hoover Institute. Shultz joined the Theranos board. The Stanford connections helped give the very young Elizabeth Holmes credibility and access to powerful people and investors. Theranos went on to raise more than $700 million from investors before the company collapsed. Holmes was convicted of defrauding investors in 2022, and she and her former business partner, Sunny Balwani, were ultimately ordered to pay $452 million in restitution to victims. So yes, basically what she did was Henry Kissinger was on the board. They were all in there, and somehow she rigged the thing up. Well, whoever is in charge, They rigged the thing up so when Holmes and her partner Sonny went down, the rest of the people like Kissinger and all them, well, they were protected. They got to keep the money and run. So, and another famous Stanford case, Sam Bankman-Fried, or FTX, both of his parents, Joseph Bankman and Barbara Fried, were Stanford law professors. Bankman-Fried grew up in the Stanford environment, and his parents' Stanford property became his residence while he was awaiting trial. So yes, his parents, Stanford's a huge campus, and they have a lot of housing on campus, so his parents were living on the Stanford campus when the son was pulling off this heist. Like I said, these people are really just fronts, right? They're not I don't believe that kid or Theranos got started by those people. They're just what I would consider the front people, right? So then we have, out of that whole FTX thing, there was a girl named Caroline Ellison with Alameda Research. She was a Stanford graduate who became CEO of Alameda Research, the trading firm at the center of the FTX collapse. She pleaded guilty and testified against Bankman-Fried. And then we have Andrew Huberman. He's on Stanford campus. He runs a place called Huberman Lab at the Stanford School of Medicine. He's a neuroscientist who turned his Stanford credentials into an enormous podcast and wellness platform. He discusses supplements, hormones, dopamine, cold exposure, sleep, and biological optimization. He later became the subject of extensive reporting, particularly a 2024 New York Magazine investigation concerning his conduct toward women and allegations that he maintained multiple romantic relationships. He also made millions selling that green stuff. You know, those people selling that green stuff were making a fortune. I think they were getting paid like, I don't know, the consumer paid like $100, and each of these people were getting like $10 a bag. And Huberman sold millions of those bags, and he was making $10 per bag. So anyway, then we have Peter Thiel. He was a Stanford undergraduate and Stanford law graduate. While he was there, he founded the Stanford Review. He went on to PayPal and Palantir. His interests include radical longevity, parabiosis, young blood. Yet he's invested in a company that sells young blood. He is really big into Rene Girard's theories, Christianity, apocalypse, and lengthy lectures concerning the Antichrist. Yeah, these people all sound really stable to me. And then we have Rene Girard. He's a Stanford professor and major intellectual influence on Thiel. He developed theories involving mimetic desire, rivalry, scapegoating, sacrifice, religion, violence, and ultimately apologetic catastrophe. Then we have another sharp one, Alex Karp. I had some clips of Alex Karp. I don't know if it's drugs or what it is, but he has appeared on stage actually barely able to sit in his chair. It got so bad that people were doing memes about it. Literally, look up Alex Karp sitting in the chair. He literally can't sit still. He lunges around. It's really, well, it looks insane, right? And these are the leaders, right? So Alex Karp is with Palantir. He's a Stanford law graduate who met Thiel at Stanford. Palantir subsequently became deeply embedded in government, intelligence, defense, military, immigration, and data analytic systems. And another Palantir founder, a guy named Joe Lonsdale, he's a Stanford graduate, and he went on to become a major Silicon Valley venture capitalist. Another, Stephen Cohen, he's another one. He connects with Palantir. The Stanford Review Network, they're calling it. Thiel's student newspaper became an extraordinary network connecting numerous people who subsequently entered technology, venture capital, Palantir, and politics. Anyway, so Reid Hoffman from the PayPal, the LinkedIn. Remember LinkedIn? Obviously, they have some pretty bad security problems, I would say. Yeah, Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn. Special place in my heart. Sam Altman was also a Stanford student, but he did drop out. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, founders of Google, they came out of Stanford. Google grew directly out of Larry Page and Sergey Brin's graduate research at Stanford in the 1990s. Their page rank search technology was Stanford's intellectual property, which Stanford later licensed to Google. What began as a university search engine research eventually became one of the largest information advertising and data companies in history. And gee, right there, founded with your tax dollars at Stanford. The story later expanded beyond search and advertising. Google's parent company, Alphabet, created Calico in 2013 to research aging and longevity. These people really are into that longevity stuff, aren't they? I guess if you think the devil's going to get you, you might want to outrun it, right? So anyhow, so yeah, I have all of them listed down below. Then we had one big scandal. The Stanford president named Mark Loving was a neuroscientist and president of Stanford University. He resigned as president in 2023 after an investigation into problems with scientific papers connected to laboratories he had led. The investigation did not find that he personally committed research misconduct, but it did find problems. Yeah, he resigned as Stanford's president, but remained a Stanford faculty member. Gee, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So yeah, um, yeah, I've got all the little things down below. That guy from Terraform Labs. Yeah, what happens is these people, well, you're going to have to decide for yourself. I would say these people aren't really that sharp. They're really not innovators. They're front people, right? Probably front people for the BIS. So here's how the connection worked. William Shockley had Shockley Semiconductor, which grew into Fairchild Semiconductor, which then spun into Intel. Frederick Terman encouraged William Shockley to establish his semiconductor operations near Stanford. Shockley's Semiconductor became one of the foundational companies of Silicon Valley. But then Shockley later became one of America's most notorious public advocates of eugenics ideas, including proposals involving voluntary sterilization and IQ. In 1957, 8 Shockley employees, it was called the famous Traitorous 8, left to establish Fairchild Semiconductor, which then went to Intel down the road, right? Fairchild then became the launching point for numerous semiconductor companies. In 1968, Fairchild executives Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left Fairchild and founded Intel, with Andy Grove joining them shortly afterwards. And Andy Grove, by the way, is Eastern European. See, imagine that, right? So yeah, Cisco Systems, that was also founded by, they developed an important Stanford router technology and ownership uses. Yeah, so then they make it private, right? Here's the big one to pay attention to. The Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, created in 1946 in association with Stanford as an applied research organization. It later separated from Stanford. So, yeah, SRI is all involved in DARPA, the people who funded the internet. They also have ARPANET. I have it all listed down below. So yeah, that is how they all connect. And I don't know. You don't really have to go too far to see that. Gee, it looks to me like, well, I mean, Shockley, people said that he was too difficult to get around. And so they left and founded these other companies calling themselves the Traitorous Eight. And then they go on to really, I looked through the records as carefully as I could. None of them, Gordon Moore, Andy Grove, none of them mentioned Shockley and the eugenics part. So I think the history was pretty well just kind of carved out, right? And other winning Silicon Valley things, we have Airbnb. I have the whole list down below. I'm not going to go over all of them, but yeah, they always say they don't come up with ideas of things that we've never heard of, right? Like we always heard of hotels, right? Most of us knew how to book reservations and drive into a hotel. So it always starts out this way, that it's a good deal, right? Airbnb at first was a good deal for people to stay in these houses and stuff. Well, I always thought it sounded kind of creepy if you ask me. But anyway, so it was a good deal. Now it's so expensive that people are fleeing like crazy. They started off the share ride stuff too, Uber and all that. The drivers were getting well paid. It was a good deal. Everybody loved it, right? Now the drivers can barely afford chocolates or peanuts, and yeah, everybody's hurting, right? They clawed back all the money. So the pattern is always the same. And even companies, Mark Andreessen, he's always, well, I'm going to tell you about how I'm going to run the world for you. Well, he came out of, it all came out of technology, right? These people, they always position Silicon Valley people. My favorite one is, well, they started this in a garage. They did not start these businesses in garages. They were well funded from the beginning. Tesla, they're all government money, right? Palantir was funded by the CIA. It has an investment firm called NQTel. That is an investment firm run by the CIA. That is where Palantir got its original funding. So I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I don't know. Here's what we keep being told. We're told stories like, well, two brilliant guys founded a company, but their fuller history may have started years, sometimes decades earlier. It begins with taxpayer money and government research. That research moves into university laboratories where scientists and graduate students develop new technologies. Then come the patents and prototypes. Then technology transfers and the licensing. Then venture capital, those geniuses from venture capital, they enter the picture. And finally, the story we all recognize, the billionaire founder. So yeah, Elon Musk gives us another version of the same story. In that case, you can begin with a private entrepreneur. He did not invent the Tesla. Somebody else did. He maneuvered his way in and took it over. And that was followed by government loans, contracts, and incentives, and ultimately an enormous private enterprise. So yeah, and that brings me back to the question of trust, because the mythology matters. If someone is asking society to entrust him with our transportation, communications, artificial intelligence, space infrastructure, or enormous amounts of personal data, partly because he's portrayed as a singular genius who created it, then it's reasonable to ask, well, who actually built the foundation? Who paid for it? Who took the early risk? And who ultimately got the prize? Google came out of Stanford research supported in part by federal money. Netscape grew out of work done at a federally supported university. Silicon Graphics came out of Stanford. Sun Microsystems, it has it in its name, came out of Stanford. The internet itself grew out of decades of government and university research. Elon Musk's companies have benefited enormously from government contracts, loans, and public policy. These guys did not simply walk alone into the wilderness with a screwdriver and come back carrying the future. There were taxpayers, universities, scientists, engineers, government research programs, public infrastructure, decades of work that came before them. Then look at what happened when some of these celebrated companies and founders were finally examined more closely. Look at Theranos. How about WeWork? Like we never had offices, right? I mean, come on. I traveled my whole life for work. I would not have considered renting an office somewhere. You work out of your hotel room. That is your office. You don't need to rent some space somewhere. Then we had Uber, we had Nikola, and we had Ozzy. Billions and billions of dollars. Extraordinary promises. Where are those self-driving cars, I want to know? Then came the Musk era. Musk bought Twitter, and suddenly the conversation wasn't just about electric cars and rockets anymore. It was about free speech, censorship, politics, information, and power. And now AI takes us to an entirely different level. These people aren't merely asking us to buy their computers, download their apps, rent their offices, ride in their cars, or use their websites. Increasingly, they're asking us to trust them with information, communication, AI, enormous amounts of personal data, and decisions that could profoundly affect how human beings live and work. That is a different proposition. For years, the message from Silicon Valley was essentially this: trust us. We can build incredible things. And they did. But somewhere along the way, the proposition changed. Now it increasingly sounds like this: trust us. We should decide what the future looks like. Why? Being brilliant doesn't make someone honest. Being rich doesn't make someone wise. Building a successful company doesn't make someone trustworthy. And being able to create powerful technology certainly doesn't give anyone a moral right to decide how the rest of humanity should live. So maybe the question isn't whether these people are geniuses. Maybe some of them are. The question is much simpler. Tech bros want to control the future. Why should we trust them? Because the more I look at the history of technology, the more it sometimes resembles a magic trick. These people appear to be figureheads like Musk. No one can run a bunch of companies and be on Twitter 24/7. We're shown what is happening on stage. The genius, the invention, the billionaire, the amazing new technology. But a magic trick depends on what you don't see. The taxpayer money, the universities, the government research, the military contracts, the scientists and engineers who came before them. The infrastructure was already there. And then the magician steps forward and takes the bow. Perhaps the question isn't only what should we trust? Maybe it's what aren't we being shown? Be safe out there and goodbye for now.